Hello, Rune, and welcome on Extinction Rebellion's YouTube. And we're going to talk about a common narrative. You have experience in as a doctor, a PhD, sorry, in religion, in the history of religion, and you have this perspective on the Nordic Animism, which I find very interesting. We're going to have a Nordic rebellion, and we need a common narrative. So I wanted to ask you how this could fit with the Nordic animist tradition. Yes, and I've been following Rune on his YouTube channel called Nordic Animism, where there's these very like deep history, deep narratives and stories about all kinds of certain stories about greed, about Ragnarok, which is about climate change, and I think this would be very interesting for Extinction Rebellion to hear what you have to say. So you have the full time. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Lucas. And yes, thanks. I'm happy and honored to be here, invited here to Extinction Rebellion. As Lucas just named, my name is, or mentioned, my name is Rune Hjarnø Rasmussen. I'm a Danish historian of religion, and I'm working at on looking at the kinds of animist knowledge that were rejected in the process through which we have become modern, and how that can be related to sustainability knowledge. Animism as really a kind of knowledge of our connectedness to the world that has been rejected and throughout history, and thereby enabled this sort of rampant destruction of the world, the omnicide, as it was named by I think an Australian scholar some months back, that contemporary civilization is engaging. Right. I sense that what's happening right now is that culture is moving into new sort of narratives. New narratives is growing in Western culture. During the last like 10 to 15 years, we've had this very strong focus on empowerment, criticism of privilege, criticism of different kinds of power. Marginalized groups have been demanding their place, and so we've had strong focus on different sexualities, gender, race, all these kind of things. What's happening right now is that focus is, I wouldn't say it's changing away from it, because these are probably still part of how people are going to think, but perhaps it's lifting up a little bit, and we're starting to have a strong focus on custodianship, the idea that humans are culturally determined to protect nature, basically, other than human community. The idea that the world is really communities of beings, whereby only some of these beings are humans, but they all demand respect and kindness. And a lot of people are talking about indigenous knowledge, the kinds of knowledge that you find among Native Americans, natives, well, throughout the world, who have cultures of custodianship, that teach people custodianship, taking, like, humans actively taking care of the environment in which they live in. Like, for instance, when Aboriginal Australians go out and burn an area, and this burning is actually part of maintaining biodiversity in that area. That's a culture of custodianship. Culture, indigenous knowledge is also typically about kinship with the land, feeling tied with the land. How do you culturally create ties to the land around us, and the cohabitants of the land, others in the land, animals, spirits, and so on. So this is where I'm absolutely convinced that that culture will be moving in the decade that we just entered here, the 2020s. But what can we do with that? Because we are indigenous, we're majority people in Scandinavian, majority societies. We even come from expansive states. Our states are colonial too. We've some of us even inhabit states that still have colonial ties to areas and so on. Colonial ties meaning parts of our state that are sort of former colonized or post-colonial situations. Yes, and if we start claiming indigeneity, then that could actually be a little bit of a problem, because if we as sort of Eurocentral or white majority people start talking about indigeneity, then that actually moves pretty close to sort of far-right movements, and it might risk compromising indigenous empowerments, such as in a Scandinavian context, for instance, the Sami struggles for land rights, cultural rights, and so on. Still, you know, at some point we were, I guess, indigenous, and we're also, you know, ethnic groups that never really lived anywhere else, at least not in sort of recorded history. So yeah, my solution is to sort of drop the word indigenous when we talk about our knowledge or our indigeneity or our ancestral traditional animism, these things, but use sort of other words. For instance, I use traditional. I'm not so happy about the word, but it emphasizes both that there are old knowledge forms in our history that we can take out again, but also that they change. Traditional is actually something that changes. It might be something that's really old, or it might be something that was there in our grandparents' age. It also emphasizes sort of perhaps a fracture or perhaps even opposition to parts of what is sometimes called modernity. Another word I often use is animism, which is the idea that we need to relate to the world as a community of persons, meaning that we should relate with respect and kindness. And I imagine that you can see that if we relate to the world like that, then we relate in a less destructive way to the world. And that's not because animists haven't sometimes destroyed their environments. That has also happened, you know. I mean, forgiveness and kindness might be ideals in Christianity, but that doesn't mean that Christians are necessarily always forgiving. Righteousness and social righteousness, or not right, justice might be an important ideal in Islam, but not necessarily always practiced. Zen might be an ideal in Buddhism, but that doesn't mean that Buddhists can't be so stressed that they kill themselves, you know. And so yeah, everything is of course complicated and so on. However, I would still say that a very important value in that thing which is called animism is kinship with the land, and a kind of understanding that we are tied into the world, and that that humans are actively upholding the good functioning of the world. So for instance, a couple of years ago, we had this extremely warm summer that's like warmer than anything we've ever seen. And it really struck me. I was standing at my father's field, and it was like brown, completely like burned, because it was so hot. And then I was standing on a day that is actually St. Olaf's Day, or the Allsock or Allsmesse or something like this, which is the 28th of August, if I remember correctly. And that's a point of time where in the old days, people used to pray for rain or thunder actually to come and ripen the crops, give the last ripening to the crops. And I was standing on my father's field, and I saw the rain coming after this unnaturally hot summer. And it came like a gray carpet that was sort of flowing over drifting over the Gudno Valley. And I could like smell the rain before it came. And it was really, and I really had this realization that what we used to understand as fertility religion, you do some religious things and then the fields grow and so on, is actually an idea of responsibility. Humans are responsibly engaged in the machinery of the world in order to make it work in a good way, in order to uphold the world as a functional, kind place where humans can actually live, right? So anyway, that's just an example. What exactly is our background as Northern Europeans or Scandinavians? Is it pre-Christian religion? Well, that is very far away, and it's also sort of associated with these nationalist iconographies, such as like Vikings and stuff like that. And I think the perspective that I'm trying to introduce, and also this perspective on our traditional culture, on the animist part of our culture, is kind of limited idea of what traditional or indigenous culture really is. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to use a broader lens that can, one, open a lot of other kinds of knowledge that has been rejected in the history of us becoming modern, and that might be also open for us to relate to, use these parts of our culture to relate to sustainability, climate change, biodiversity collapse, and the whole sort of Ragnarok that we're facing these days, right? And when you look at those things, when you look, for instance, at the folklore, then you find that there are remarkable similarities between that. When you apply contemporary anthropology to that, you find that there are remarkable similarities between, I don't know, Swedish or Danish folklore, something like that, and what you would call indigenous culture, indigenous knowledge, and so on. For instance, there are profoundly animist ideas of the world. You have stuff like, just an example, like an arch example of animism is that an Inuit, when he kills a seal, he speaks to the Inuit, the soul, the person of the seal, and says, you know what, I'm sorry, I had to do this, but my children are starving, and I just want you to know that we are good and decent people in where I'm from, and I would really like you to come back another time and help feed us. Now this is an animist way of relating to the fact and the problem that you have just killed the seal. And you find the same thing in normal agrarian peasant culture in Scandinavia. Fairly short time ago, people would speak to a pig before they slaughtered it and say, we're sorry that we have to do this. We're doing this because we're hungry. Please don't hold a grudge against us because we're not going to kill you. It's just an example of that these like iconically animist aspects of culture has really been there, and that is something we can look at, and we can try to relate to it as a way of basically renewing our self-understanding in ways that can be a little bit less absolutely cataclysmically, apocalyptically destructive to the world that we're living in. If we can create modes of identity, modes of self-understanding, kinds of culture that incorporates or takes back some of these aspects, then we can create culture that is less destructive to the world, basically. So that's basically what I'm trying to do when I'm using this animist lens on our own culture and on folklore and these things. You also find all these kind of, you find many kinds of things when you do that. For instance, you find totemism, which is the idea, is a very concrete idea that we are in a kinship tie with something in the world. Totems are, in fact, communities of people. And some of these people are human and some of them aren't. So if you have stuff like, I don't know, an Anishinaabe Native American fox totem, then the fox totem is a clan. And that clan has humans in it, Anishinaabe humans, and it has foxes in it too. When you look at our culture, you find culture of totemism. And sometimes you find culture of totemism that has been incredibly resilient and lived until the 20th century. I'm talking specifically here of northern Sweden, where both between ethnic Finns, ethnic Sami, and ethnic Swedes, you have more or less exactly the same notions of bear totemism. The idea that humans are in a kinship relation with the bear. And people have had this, I know a dude in northern Sweden who has been studying this, particularly from the Swedish side. I know that people who have been totally studying the shit out of this from the Finnish side. The idea that, for instance, there's a lot of these kind of names for the bear. and they are these kind of sweet names, funny little names that indicate relation. You kind of the sweet uncle of the forest. Uncle, it's a relation. So these sort of, and you also have all kinds of tradition where you are putting on bear masks and people are dancing around doing bear dances with bear masks and these kind of things. These are totemic ideas about how humans are very, very connected to one specific species in the environment. Sometimes these kind of totemisms have been very strongly rejected. In the case of this bear totemism in northern Sweden, part of what is really impressive about it is the extent to which it has survived. But sometimes you find these totemisms in symbols that are very commonly known in our culture. An example is the Little Mermaid, the little statue standing in Copenhagen, which is an image of this mermaid figure that comes from Hans Christian Andersen's Tale of the Little Mermaid. And the root of this idea goes deep, deep, deep back into history, the root of the idea of mermaids. Mermaids are, in fact, an idea of women that can sort of turn themselves into seals. And sometimes there's also the idea of a woman with a fish tail, but they're commonly actually associated with seals. And if you look at this southern Scandinavian totemic relation, you find it back in the pre-Christian era where there were specific sea goddesses, a goddess named Gevjun, that is kind of associated with the sea. Now she plows out of the landmass of Sweden, the island Sealand, and she actually creates Denmark by pulling it into the sea and gives Denmark its shape. And then she becomes an ancestor of the royal dynasty, actually. And this thing about being an ancestor is characteristically totemic. So she creates Sealand, which literally means the sea land, and is a kind of a sea goddess who creates the sea land somehow, and then she becomes an ancestor of an important clan, very important clan or dynasty in this area, right? And so up through Danish history, you see that there's this tendency to iconize or personify this area as a mermaid. So and that's something that you sort of find again and again. And then the tales start telling about how the connection between humanity and the mermaid actually ruptured. So there's a very well-known ballad called Agnete, woman's name, and the merman. It's a man in this, not a mermaid, but a merman. That doesn't really matter. And the story tells about how Agnete got married. The human woman got married to this sea spirit, but then she rejected the sea spirit, and then then the sea spirit is begging her to return to their children, the children they had to bear together, and she rejects him, and then he calls collapse on kind of, you could say perhaps environmental collapse on the area. So the story is really telling how humanity's connection with these with the land, in this case the sea or the landscape, when that connection is ruptured, breaks down, then the world collapses. And this is really a myth that talks about how the modern world, I think, is being implemented, a world in which we are no longer in a kinship tie like the Anishinaabe Native Americans with the foxes or the bears or the seals. We have broken our kinship ties with the land, and when that happens, shit just breaks down. And in the last version of the story, we have Hans Christian Andersen, who is he's naturalizing that whole thing. He's normalizing that. So when he tells the story, it's also the human prince who turns away actually from the sea spirit, but that is the way it's supposed to be in Hans Christian Andersen's story. So the Little Mermaid is this sort of enamored or love-sick mermaid, sea spirit, that is, she's sitting in the sea and she's looking towards the land, actually longing for her human spouse that has left her. That's us. We have left the sea spirit. And you see, this is you could almost call it an indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge perspective on a very common symbol, in this case in Denmark, the Little Mermaid, and what is actually lying below the symbol, in this case a history of ruptured, broken down totemism, rejected totemism in our relating to the land around us, right? This is one example of animism and animist knowledge, Nordic animism, as something that has been rejected through the time. And it's also, as you see, there's also a call in this way of understanding the history, a call for us to re-engage our traditional knowledge forms in ways that reconnects us to the land, for instance. When you look at the, and these are just a couple of examples, these totemic, but when you look at throughout the folklore, and if some of you who see this are from different parts of Scandinavia, Sweden, Finland, Norway, wherever, your grandparents, would probably have had strong animist culture that has probably to a quite large extent been lost. The idea that there are spirits around us, there are perhaps elves or trolls, and they're sacred places, they're mounds all over the place, and there are trolls living inside those mounds. These are ancient sacred places. Also, there's been a lot of culture with regards to seasons and seasonal holidays and so on. The celebrations around Christmas, for instance, has been, thoroughly animist throughout Scandinavian history. And when you look at even contemporary culture around you find a lot of this traditional knowledge animism. Right. There are also examples of mythology that tells these stories about that perhaps they can admonish us or teach us sometimes the consequences of the rupture between ourselves and the land. And one particular myth that I want to mention to you is the Nordic myth of the Ragnarok. The Ragnarok is the collapse of the world as it is described in the Nordic mythology, primarily in the Eddic poem, the Elder Edda poem called the Völuspá, the prophecy of the series. If you speak a Scandinavian language, it would be called something like Völvens Spådom or something like this in your language. This prophecy emerged at a point of time where Scandinavians had actually had a relatively recent experience of hardcore consequences of climate change. Because what happened in, I think it was the 6th century, was that there was a huge volcanic eruption somewhere in Mesoamerica, something like that, and that caused a global cooling. Now, in Scandinavia, in the Iron Age, this global cooling had catastrophic consequences because it meant that summer basically didn't come for a period of years, or I don't know if it didn't come, but it was just a marked cooling. There were areas in Norway where the population decreased by 90%. I think the general population of northern Scandinavia was reduced with 50%. I don't know if you can imagine what that must have looked like on a social level. It must have been wars and death and collapse. And they can also see it in cultural expression that they decrease. What you see in Denmark is that people apparently got absolutely desperate and they started giving their gold to the land as if the world has been destroyed. We have to reconnect with the earth, with the land. So they took the most valuable thing they had, the gold, and they gave it to the land. So there's a quite short period in very, very long history of very rich archaeology in Denmark, where there's packed with gold. It's like all the gold that was found in Danish prehistory is from like a period of 25 years or something like that. So there was an experience of climate change, very strong cooling. It's called the Fimbul winter. And then in the centuries that followed on that, Scandinavia entered into what is sometimes called the Viking Age. And this was an area, of course, as you all know from school, where Scandinavians went out and had aggressive activities all over the place and burned down most of Francia and conquered England and whatnot. But this period also had effects back into Scandinavia because it changed culture. It was a period of globalization, really. The invention of ship technology meant that people had a much larger contact with other people, and Christianity came into Scandinavia, urbanization came into Scandinavia, and states started to be formed. Denmark was the first kind of Scandinavian state that sort of got formed, and you can sort of see that there are these kind of aggressive empire builders who start like building fortresses and building a state. So there's that. So the Viking Age is a period where traditional knowledge form got ruptured quite a lot. They got destroyed quite a lot, and where there was a lot of social change going on. States, Christianity, urbanization, and globalization happened in the Viking Age. Now that meant that there were cultural reactions. So the myth of the Ragnarok, the collapse of the world, as it is narrated in the Völuspá and other places, I think it kind of merges these things. It's a reflection of the climate collapse, but also in the context of lost traditional knowledge. It is as if people are saying there is a loss of kinship with the land, and when that happened, then the tree of life burns, and the dragon of the sea devours the lands, and humans lose their kindness and start killing each other randomly. And there's this very dark and very scary vision of what happens to humans when climate change destroys the place that we live. So this is a mythology that is in our culture and that we can use, I think, to understand ourselves in relation to climate change. You might say that the Völuspá, which is a prophecy, you could say, is it a prophecy of our time? It certainly speaks into our time. It certainly has things to say about exactly the kind of situation that we're in now. Loss of traditional knowledge, climate change, high level of social change. When you look around, when you look back towards indigenous groups around the world, you find these prophecies. You find the Anishinaabe prophecy of the seventh fire, which talk about collapse, environmental collapse, and similar things going on. The Ragnarok, you could say it's a Nordic prophecy of what happens when humans lose their connection to the land. And this prophecy is also something that you find in other cases of Nordic mythology. There's a myth which is called the Grotta Songer, the song of the millstone, a millstone. and this millstone was owned by a king called Frodi, who had this land that was in harmony. It was harmonious. And he had two servants who were Jotun women, giant women. That would be Jetta in Danish, or Jotna in Norwegian, and probably Jetta in Swedish too. So he had these two giant women who were driving this millstone that was producing all the wealth of Frodi's land. Then Frodi got greedy and he pressured them too much. He wanted more and more. He just wanted gold and gold. And then what happened was that these sort of fundamental forces of nature, he actually breaks his social contract with them, you could say. And when you break your social contract with the fundamental forces of nature that drive the machinery, that keeps us in a harmonious relation with the world, then the world turns on us. So these two giant women, Fenja and Menja, they turn on Frodi and call actually collapse on his kingdom. So these are a couple of myths. There are probably other myths, and now exactly how you guys in Extinction Rebellion can use this, I think perhaps I don't have like very concrete ideas, but I think that because I'm sort of looking at the material at it as in itself, and looking to sort of try to open into this sort of enormous treasure of indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge that we have, and which we can use in our process of re-engaging ways of thinking that can reconnect us to the world. Now, what I'm talking about, so I don't know exactly how you guys can transform that into activism, but I'm sure it can be done. Like one little thing that I've worked a little bit on is actually some symbols, and I'll just try to get, let me just show you. Where I've been trying to look at the kinds of symbols that that were there in traditional knowledge, what they mean, and how we can use them in a way that speaks to our intersustainability issues. I'm just going to try to share my screen and see if I can show this to you. Cool. Are you seeing my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Hey, jeg har ikke lige tid nu. Jeg sidder lige og snakker med nogen. Ja, lidt senere, min skat. Sorry. Like for instance, this symbol here is a symbol of the actually a symbol of the Yggdrasil, the tree of life. Very common, important symbol in Nordic animism, the tree. You find this thing about sacred trees and staffs and important trees and groves. You find this throughout Nordic animism. The tree is the idea, and if you read in the Nordic myths, you get this idea that the tree is filled with beings. There are different beings around the tree. There's an eagle in the top. There's a dragon in the bottom. There's different beings living in the branches of the tree. So it's very much this kind of idea of that the tree is the organic web that is sort of connecting everybody. So that's one symbol that I sort of had launched. I launched this particularly as a symbol of almost kind of logo of Nordic animism, Nordic traditional ecological knowledge from the Nordic region. Here's another example. It's actually the same. It's just from a Swedish runestone, and again, it's the tree. And you see the important aspect here is not so much the tree as a map of the world, but in relation to human beings. You see that there are these two human beings. One of these humans bring a horn, probably to give a libation to this tree. Another one holds a tree in one hand and holds a ring in the other hand. And this ring is an ancient symbol of a covenant or a bond of connection, almost like a wedding ring. A wedding ring is a symbol that you are bound to someone. And you find these rings in Nordic archaeology, the symbols of binding someone to some supernatural thing or something in the world. And here you see that he has the ring in one hand while he's holding the tree. This I think it's a very strong symbol of human connection to the a kinship tied to the land. So these was just a couple of examples of stuff that I've been fiddling with myself. I've been working to develop this perspective on our cultural history as a way of re-engaging our cultural history. And I think also an aspect of it is owning it away from aspects that have perhaps been pulling it in the wrong direction. Ph.d, du skal ikke herinde nu. Jeg vil lige op og sige hej. This is my little daughter. And part of the idea, there's almost a thought about kinds of colonization in this, that we are majority populations. We've not been exposed to genocide, land theft, cultural oppression of these things. But there are modes of, I do think there are modes of cultural oppression that also majority populations have experienced. So, for instance, the animist knowledge forms that are in our history, they have been discontinued through processes that are very comparable to the kinds of cultural oppression that you find when you look, for instance, at indigenous populations. And part of this project, or part of this process, is the way that nationalisms, for instance, they step in and they own our cultural heritage. So kind of, if you're into prehistoric Nordic stuff, that it has sort of been owned a little bit too much from this nationalist perspective. And that is not something that's given at all. If you are Maori from Aotearoa, New Zealand, then traditional knowledge is not something that implies aggressive nationalism, for instance, at all. It's something that is supposed to connect us to the land, and the connection to the land, that doesn't have for instance, doesn't have a color. If you are a white or a mixed Dane, then that is the same thing, because you're in the same land, right? It's not something that is inherently owned more by one population than another, I think. And working with this indigenous knowledge, I think it is a way of basically going in and owning what it is to be a Euro descendant, what it is to be a white person, and changing it towards inclusive sustainability. And that's why it's important for a number of reasons. It changes the root of what it means to be a Euro descendant, being Danish, being Swedish, being a Northern European person, in a sustainable and inclusive way. Did that make sense, Lucas?
It made total sense. I have a billion questions actually, but I don't think we can go through them all. Just need to see what I think is most interesting. I think you have, of course, talked a lot about them yourself, but I think there's like you just told us about what I think could be the threat that we are facing, and is the threat we're facing actually, which is this hyper individualism, this Amazonism, which is taking over as a kind of and Amazon is actually creating its own shock doctrine as well, destroying markets for them and running on a they're not even gaining money, they're just destroying the market so they then later can come in. This is a major force, and it's a strong and solid big hierarchy, which really is also basically slavery, this is a threat, big threat could come, and this in relation to the story you told about how the with the Ragnarok and this also this urbanization and socialization and Christianity that came in, I think is this could very well happen again. And I thought I really see the point in this, that if we this can really transcend this whole individualist thinking, if we get this view of humans being like as you say, like the protectors or the guardians or whatever of nature, and this will also level the hierarchy much more than that we see us as equals instead of just like people who fight each other at the marketplace or for each other's industries and so on, and keep being in this competition and this fight. So I thought that was really interesting. Also,
yeah, I think what you're talking about from like when I'm thinking about these processes, like the kind of feudal expansionism of the Amazon empire, like I'm thinking about these kind of very current social processes, from trying to think about them from a traditional knowledge perspective, and I see this as results, to a large extent, results of rupture relation. What I think what happened with what is sometimes called attention extraction capitalism is that this thing that the social media is mirroring back to us our expectations or their analysis, which has become very, very big, of our expectations, and this has actually secluded people from each other, so that we're not communicating at all with our political opponents. They're not communicating with us. This is causing these really, really radical developments, where all of a sudden you have like 40 billion people who, I don't know, don't believe that the coronavirus exists, or are kind of moving into these fairly grotesque ideas that seem like completely detached from reality. And I think what you talk about with these radical forms of capitalism that has gone completely out of, I mean, capitalism used to be like, I don't know, a shoemaker or something like this wanting to build his own little shop, and that was sort of considered a kind of, I don't know, a good thing, a salt of the earth sort of ideology or whatever it used to be. And now what you really have is like a sort of Star Wars empire sort of scenario, where you have these obscene giants who own so much of the world that it also actually destroys the capitalist markets. So the capitalist forces, we've seen that a little bit in the US, that they're actually bringing these big tech into court. Because they see it as a threat against the markets itself. However, by now it's probably so powerful that it can't be stopped. And Amazon, I think, is a horrible example of it. And this is, I think, it's a collapse symptom. It's a symptom of collapse of fundamental human sort of relation to each other, basically. That these kind of things emerge.
Yes. Okay, and there's also this like there's important like what is really important in the Extinction Rebellion is that we have this disruption and sacrifice. Like how do you change what you disrupted to make it change, for like a new knowledge to seep in? You have to like create some sort of disturbance, and this is very fundamental. This is why we block the roads. This is why we go to the big the head offices and the states departments and so on, to like disrupt this and make it, and tell them like this needs to change. And you talked a lot about sacrifice, a little about sacrifice at least, which I thought was really important to understand, and also to like to make very strong in the narrative, because like people have to understand that this like that this what we do is actually very it causes a lot of pain in us, and we're also like dealing, I think, a lot of us with some mental health issues, actually, because first of all, we're not connected to nature, which is of course destroying us fundamentally, because we are nature. You can feel it. If you pinch your skin, you're gonna feel that you are nature. But also that like this that we then put ourselves at risk to protect a greater good, which is of course nature. So for this, this could be really, really important to like dive into and make people understand that what it takes to create a new society is to sacrifice your privileges, and this has to be like commonly understood that it is a big thing. Like I think now in Extinction Rebellion Denmark, like we have almost $1 million kroners of fines now, and I think in Norway they really got hurt as well, like in this. And I think the people haven't really understood the reality of this. I've heard people say like, "Oh, Extinction Rebellion is just whatever pseudo activism." I was like, "Do you know how much we are in debt now because of what we've done?" And I think she kind of turned and was like, "Oh yeah, she didn't really think about that," and like, no. And this, of course, has to, like everything we do is we can't really expect people to understand it. So this would also be nice to have some kind of like myths that or tales that could help us explain this. And I, of course, think that this is very important. You also bring in your kid, is that this has to be like very commonly understood in these terms of, like, I remember I worked in the kindergarten. And I was like struggling a bit on how to communicate with these kids, but then I like took them out to the sump. It's called sump, like and then I was like just telling them about this troll and these like beings and so on, and they were just like, "Oh my god!" And the kid just ran away because I told that they were looking at us, and it was just so intense. And you couldn't make this. It was not to scare. Of course, you shouldn't scare the kids too much, but it was just to say like they understand trolls and this whole perspective way more than they would understand a curve.
Totally. And what you're talking about right there, I think that is a fundamental problem of any communication that has been done about climate change and biodiversity breakdown in the last 50 years. What the problem is that people have been communicating without mythology. People have been communicating as if everybody can actually understand and relate to an 800 pages long climate report from a UN agency that documents methane gas release and global tipping points and ice core analysis and these kind of things. And we can't. There are 4 scientists in the world who understand that, well, maybe 40, who understand that stuff. And normal human beings, they need mythologies because mythologies are tools for us to relate to the world that we live in. Now, and this is also why I'm talking about the Ragnarok, because I think the Ragnarok is a mythology that tells us that story in a way that is existentially impactful. It's a kind of story that we can understand and relate to. It's an apocalyptic story, and we are standing in front of an apocalypse. I don't think people understand that. I think people are looking at the climate change. It sounds so weird, but they're not thinking, then they're not seeing the human consequences of all of West Africa becoming Sahara. What that means, that is hundreds of millions of people suddenly living in an area that is uninhabitable for human life, and these are the kinds of scenarios that we're looking at. These are Ragnarok apocalyptic scenarios, and I think we need that kind of narrative in order to understand it. Like I already launched the idea of that, thinking about the dynamics that move in humans in terms of the einherjar, which is sort of the dead warriors that fight alongside the gods in the Ragnarok to protect the organized existence. And I think we can metaphorically, we can see movements such as Extinction Rebellion as a movement of the einherjar. These are dead warriors. Perhaps these are ancestors that are whispering to us how we can move in order to protect organized human existence. Perhaps these are the kind of forces that manifest in different ways, and sometimes in ways that are perhaps oppositional to each other. Like maybe one voice is Greta Thunberg, maybe there are other voices as well. And I think one main obstacle that we might have in the people who are trying to deal with climate change is that when we get one idea, then we tend to lock ourselves a little bit into it. Like, for instance, I'm critical of the idea of green capitalism. I don't have a very big belief in it. I think that capitalism needs to be revised according to animist traditional knowledge perspectives in order to bring it into alignment with the environment that we need. However, that's just my idea, and I might be wrong. And solutions are complex, and they are multifaceted. I recently read this, and I very much recommend it, this book here by the Aboriginal Australian author called Tyson Junker-Porter. It's called Sand Talk, where he is implying an Australian indigenous knowledge perspective on contemporary empire, contemporary capitalism, and so on. And he talks about this thing that the hyper complex problems that we have needs hyper complex solutions, and these hyper complex solutions, they emerge in complex relations made between human beings. And that is exactly what is the problem, I think, of the way that internet and social media works right now. It is that it ruptures those networks. We are not in network with our political opponents, for instance. Like, I profoundly detest the dominating tendency of Islamophobia in Denmark, for instance. That's my personal political position. However, when I am, for instance, doing my own little cancel culture on on people who practice these ideas, which I do, then I'm rupturing myself from connection with them. That doesn't just mean that I sort of protect my own little space. It also means that I don't bring my intelligence into connection with them. I don't listen to their fear, because their ideology is an expression of fear. That fear is not being engaged. There isn't any connection to it. That means that it runs wild. And this is what we see in the traditional knowledge perspective on the Ragnarok, that the connection with dangerous forces is broken, and then they run wild. The wolf in Nordic mythology runs wild when the bond to it is broken. The Jotnar, the giants, they are in some sort of negotiated relation with the powers that uphold the harmonious world. But when these relations break down, when they rupture, then they run wild and they become very dangerous and destructive. And I think this is what we're seeing at the moment, that these sort of these forces are becoming they're becoming secluded into their own mirror cabinets. We also live in mirror cabinets, by the way. Perhaps we're wrong about some things, and that makes for very, very dangerous collapse promoting situations.
Yes. I completely agree. Also, like, if you look at the revolutionary communist movement, actually, they were very hyper focused on materialism, for example. But this has actually been like revived. Some of their philosophers, as Gramsci, he there was a big problem for them that he actually says that they lost this fight because there's a lot of power in all of this, in the culture. And the hegemony is actually very much more. It's not a total thing. It's not only in capitalism or whatever. It's everywhere. And I think we're gonna lose the fight if it, as you also, it's common sense for us maybe that if it's only like communicated in these like dogmatic sciencey ways, right? So I think it's fundamental.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
I just have to see if I have any other questions. I've written Totemism, internationalism, because I think there's a bit of a danger in the. Yeah, I'm interested how you're going to respond to this, because there's a bit of a danger in like people would think that if we Nordics just do our thing, then I'm just excluding ourselves from the rest of the world, like the climate crisis, international thing.
Yeah, but I think
and how is these like Nordic tales then also gonna, like, how can they maybe transcend this whole thing?
Well, my specific idea of Nordic animism is kind of predicated on the idea of traditional European knowledge, which is predicated on, or built on ideas of indigenous knowledge. And these are, indigenous knowledge is obviously almost a universal thing if you sort of lift it a little bit out of the concrete situations. European traditional knowledge is universal for all your descendants. So what I'm trying to do is really just to say, okay, there are local ideas of kinship, custodianship, and relation that we can re-engage. And these are also, I think, relevant for Euro descendants in other parts of the world. First, it's relevant for a large part of Northern Europe. I think when you talk about Nordic animism, I mean, I have very fluffy definition of it, but I think it's kind of relevant from like somewhere in Balticum and Baltics and into somewhere in the British Isles. It's something like, you know, it's a pretty broad space and as a root culture, but then it's also relevant for a lot of North Americans. And I think that these perspectives on the world, I don't think they have to be, for instance, universal in their perspective. You know, they are flowing, these traditional perspectives are flowing around and sort of cross-pollinating each other in many ways. What you see with Afro-descendants is that religious perceptions from specific ideas in specific areas in Africa are becoming gigantic in the New World. So you find the Orisha cult, these kind of deities that they look very much like Nordic deities in the voodoo religion. So you find it in Brazil, Caribbean, North America, and so on. And this is a natural way that things grow and interact. So I think that when we are, say, launching ideas of Nordic animism, I think that it could be a direct call for people to also launch I don't know, Central European animism or Slavic animism and so on. So the idea of traditional knowledge as kind of ecologically sane ways of relating to the world, I think that fundamental idea is universal. But in order to work, it also has to be locally grounded. It has to be connected to specific things. And I also think, by the way, like, don't think about this whole idea of Nordic animism as like a religion, for instance, or one set of ideas. I think if you go from central Finland to the Faroe Islands to the southern part of Denmark, you find very, very different regions, very, very different environments, similar kinds of people in some ways that are, you know, share certain ideas, but they're relating to rather different environments. So you find also very different kinds of animism. You could hone in, and then you could say, you know, Southern Jutland animism, or you could own in another place and you could say, okay, so Icelandic animism, if you wanted to. I have just sort of chosen this sort of perspective in order to have a box that I can work with, and in order to be able to understand sort of an area in the world. Also, in order to have material enough, like if I wanted to create a perspective on the world that was called Central Jutland animism, that's where I'm from, then I probably wouldn't have a lot of material to work from. But when you broaden it a little bit, then you get more basis of understanding. And I think that for instance, the idea of totemism. Now, totemism is a kind of community, but what you also see in totemisms is that these are very trans-ethnic. I mentioned the example of the Northern Scandinavian bear totemism, which is very clear that people in those areas, they relate to bears in specific ways. They're not in specific ways. They're not like saying, "Oh, I am Swedish, so I have this innate, deep Swedish culture that I'm manifest." They're relating to bears, so which is why Swedes are doing it, and perhaps they're doing it in kind of Swedish ways. They definitely probably are, but their neighbors who are, they are perhaps the word in Swedish would be skogsfinnar, or they would be men who are in Swedish called Tornedalsfinnar, or they will be Sami, also relating to bears. So they and these people living up there, they might have animism that in that sense are very they're very trans-ethnic, and they are perhaps different from what people have in the Faroe Islands, where there are no bears, but there are rocks and there are birds, and sea. And so, yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
I think it did. I also agree. Like, I see that this whole connection to nature is going to transcend this like nationalism, and if we understand it correctly on these ways that you explain.
Totemism is very much not, I think, very much not a nationalist way of understanding community, of building us. Nationalism is an idea of us, right? And nationalism, I think, is characterized by looking inwards. It looks for an essence inside us, say Danishness or the white race, something like that. These are nationalisms. And then it also creates an outer distinction. An outer distinction. There is an other to nationalism. But totemisms are a little bit different. They're like, you're not creating a sense of self by looking inside. You're actually creating a sense of self by looking outside. And you're forming relation. And it's that relation that is the important thing, not the distinction. So it's relating instead of distinguishing. There are probably also distinctions in totemisms. Things aren't that simple that nationalisms and totemisms are just opposed. But I think there is an aspect in which totemism is a relational thing that reaches out. And I think that there's an aspect of that, of this animist way of forging community that is comparable to the notion of solidarity. Solidarity in socialism is an active way of forming a community with other. It's like, and I think it's such a shame that at least in Denmark, in our sort of common social space, that the concept of solidarity has been so left behind, as if it was something that kind of overly self-righteous 1970s Marxists were only saying. And now we have this horrendous idea called sammenhængskraft, which basically means coherence, something like that, which is very much this sort of inner thing. It's something that's inside you. It's sort of defined by the person who's talking about it, where solidarity is something you go out in the world and do. You build with somebody else. And the more other that person is almost the better. And so I think that these particular ways of building community might have a strong potential to use traditional knowledge to build community in essentially very progressive ways.
Indeed. Okay. Yes, thank you for this. I have, of course, speculated in a long time how to give you a decent platform, and I think this is the right way.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for bringing me on, having me on.
Yeah, so, of course. Cool. So I think, yeah, as you said, this is for us to take and find out how we can use this. I think there's obvious ways. Building a big troll, put it in the street to block cars, something like that. And we will, of course, I think, get back to you if we have more questions. Cool. And but there's of course your YouTube channel, which we can link to, and there's a lot of awesome stuff in there.
Definitely. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. And see you around.
Yeah, see you around.